Hello and welcome to SBA proposed rule changes and how they will impact government contractors, a PilieroMazza webinar. My name is Megan Connor and I'm a partner in PilieroMazza's Government Contracts Group. I'm based in our Washington, D.C. office and I counsel clients on a variety of issues, including how to comply with SBA's regulations. I'm joined today by my partner, Peter Ford, who leads our Boulder, Colorado office. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Megan. Good afternoon, everyone.
Peter also works within our Government Contracts Group and assists clients with all of the small business procurement programs like the 8A program and WOSB program, both of which we'll touch on today. We're going to go through changes in receipts calculation, including the Runway Extension Act. I know that that's a hot topic that a lot of people want to have an update on. Where we stand on limitations on subcontracting, the proposed changes to the HUBZone program, as well as proposed changes to the WOSB, EDWOSB program. And then at the end, we'll cover some small changes, proposed changes to the 8A program. We're going to save time for questions at the end, so please go ahead and submit your questions as we go. One point that I want to make clear is that we're touching on proposed rules today with the exception of something that we'll cover up front. Everything else is just proposed, which means that they have to go through the rulemaking process, including the public comment period. That is where it takes time for SBA to issue its final regulations, which will implement these changes. Sometimes it's hard to predict when that final rule will come out, and so we'll do our best to touch on that, but just be mindful that these are all proposed. Nothing's final yet, and in one case, you still have an opportunity to shape what the regulation will look like and how it will shape your company. We're going to cover lots of information and provide you a couple sites that you'll want to Google later, so be sure you have a pad and pen handy. So the first big topic, and this is the final rule that I mentioned in the overview. So this is final, this is in place, this is not subject to any more public comment, and that is SBA's revised size standards methodology. In April, SBA issued its revised size standard methodology white paper, in which SBA is moving away from what they call an anchor approach to a percentile approach. SBA is also moving away from the fixed number of size standard levels or bands, and instead each industry will have its own size standard based on that industry's data. The white paper addresses both receipts-based size standards and employee-based size standards. It's a very tough read. It's written by a gentleman who has his PhD in economics. So if you also have your PhD in economics, then it might be an enjoyable read for you. But the most important takeaway is that although SBA is changing the size standard methodology, SBA does not believe that this will have a major practical impact on small businesses. Essentially, that the range of size standards SBA forecasts will be the same in the new methodology. SBA, in that same rulemaking in April where it said this is our final revised white paper, SBA said that it plans to issue proposed rules on all receipts-based size standards, including those in Sector 54 and Subsector 236 in the near future. NAICS Sector 54 is the largest services sector. That's professional, scientific, and technical services. So if you are performing a services contract for the federal government, odds are it has a NAICS code that starts with a 54 ahead of it. So that change is coming in the near future. And then Subsector 236 is construction. So again, be on the lookout. SBA will have to go through the rulemaking process when it increases the receipts-based size standards. And again, in that rulemaking process, they'll issue a proposed rule. It will be subject to public comment, and then SBA will issue its final rule after it reviews all the public comments. In the meantime, effective yesterday, August 19th, SBA increased all the receipts-based size standards for inflation. This is roughly a $1.5 to $2 million increase across the board. So for instance, if you were previously performing under the NAICS code for computer-related services, which had a size standard of 27.5, your new size standard as of yesterday is $30 million. That applies to all solicitations issued on or after August 19th. These are the new size standards. So the column on the left is what your prior size standard was, The column on the right is the new size standard, effective yesterday. The citation for this regulation, where you can see where all of these size standards are and the new size standards, is 13 CFR 121.201. Now the hot topic is next. The Small Business Runway Extension Act of 2018. The act became law on December 17, 2018, and it amended the Small Business Act to change the 3-year calculation to a 5-year calculation. It is SBA's position that Congress amended the wrong subsection of the Small Business Act. So SBA has been slow to implement this change. SBA finally published its proposed rule on June 24th. And this proposed rule would change SBA's regulations to also incorporate a 5-year calculation, a 5-year period of measurements. Comments to this rule are due Friday. This is your opportunity to shape how this is going to be implemented in SBA's regulations. Now, SBA's position is that Congress amended the subsection of the Small Business Act that applies when agencies besides SBA issue size standards. SBA argues in its proposed rulemaking that this has been its position since 2002. And if you're interested in looking up that rulemaking in SBA's argument, the citation is 84 Federal Register 29399. If you Google that, it will come up, 84 Federal Register 29399, or 84 FR 29399. And in that rulemaking, SBA explains why Congress amended the wrong subsection, but then says, nevertheless, to promote consistency, SBA has agreed to amend its regulations to align with the amended regulation or amended language in the Small Business Act. Again, comments are due on Friday. After that, it could potentially take months before SBA issues a final rule that actually changes its regulations to incorporate the 5-year rule. Many contractors do not know how to handle the disconnect between the federal law and SBA's regulations. On the one hand, federal law takes precedence over federal regulations. So a contractor could reasonably rely on the 5-year calculation in the Small Business Act. But on the other hand, the agency charged with determining a contractor size for purposes of a federal procurement is the SBA. So if the SBA says 3 years, it may be prudent to follow 3 years. You should also be aware that GAO has now weighed in on this. On Friday, GAO denied a bid protest in which the bid protesters argued that the 5-year calculation should apply to GSA's OASIS on-ramp. GAO deferred to SBA on this and found that SBA's interpretation of the Runway Extension Act as requiring rulemaking by either SBA or any agency promulgating its own size standard to implement the revision of the 3-year average to a 5-year average, and the prospective effect of that revision was subject to great deference by GAO. So GAO found that GSA properly applied the 3-year calculation and not the 5-year calculation to the OASIS on-ramp. That GAO decision is Technax, LLC, Regional Corporation, and what you want to Google is the B number, which is B-4086885.22. B-4086885.22. If you Google that or go on GAO's website, you should be able to pull up GAO's decision. If this were taken to the Court of Federal Claims, we do not know if the court would reach the same decision. So there's still a question there because GAO is obviously a co-agency to SBA. It's unclear how a federal court would interpret, considering that federal law supersedes federal regulation. Now, there's also a chance that Congress will act before SBA's rule is final and force SBA to apply the 5-year calculation immediately and to give it retroactive effect. So the legislation you'll want to track to see if Congress does do that is first the House version of the NDAA, Section 872 is the House's attempt to fix this. So in Section 872, the House version of the NDAA, the House is saying that SBA must issue a final rule by December 17th, 2019, again, to implement the 5-year calculation, and that SBA also must implement a transition plan. This version of the NDAA passed the House on July 12th. However, there's nothing in the Senate version of the NDAA, and the site for that is S1790. There's nothing in the Senate version of the NDAA that addresses the Runway Extension Act. Instead, Section 705 of the Senate Small Business Committee's version of the SBA Reauthorization and Improvement Act says that the 5-year calculation applies retroactively to December 17, 2018, and requires SBA to implement a transition plan. The problem is that this SBA Reauthorization Act is stuck in committee. So it's not on the Senate floor, hasn't been voted on. The Senate version of the NDAA did pass the Senate. And to take you all back to your civics or government class in high school, the House and the Senate will now have to have conference committees to reach agreement on the version of the NDAA that will be presented to the president. So you have an opportunity here. You can call your senators and ask your senators to put something in the NDAA akin to what's in the House version of the NDAA that forces SBA to act on the 5-year rule. If you watched or read my testimony before the House Small Business Committee back in March, you'll know that a transition period is something that I advocated for. And both the House NDAA and then this Senate SBA Reauthorization Act do also implement a transition plan. If you wanted to see Congress act on this, then you should, again, reach out to your senators. Beyond reaching out to your senators, if you want to impact SBA's implementation of the Runway Extension Act, you should consider submitting comments to SBA's proposed rulemaking, which begs the question, how do I submit comments? The website is regulations.gov. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a search feature. You can use either this docket ID, SBA-2019-006, or you can use the RIN 3245-AH16, or you can use this link that directs you right to the comment page. You insert your comments in the text box and/or you can upload it as a letter. You do not have to identify yourself. You can do it anonymously, but sometimes it helps SBA to see that comments are coming from industry. Your comments will be available to the public on the regulations.gov website. Once you're done inserting and uploading your comments, you'll click continue and you'll be able to preview them before you formally submit. Here's a screenshot of what it looks like if you were to upload comments in the text box, but you can see right below the text box, there's an upload file feature that allows you to upload your comments as a separate file. PilieroMazza will be submitting our comments on Friday. We are advocating in our comments that SBA should adopt a 2-year transition period to mitigate harm and confusion in industry. During this 2-year period, we are suggesting that contractors should be able to choose either the 3-year calculation or the 5-year calculation. We arrived at 2 years based on the difference between the two calculations. So if you are a firm that you are small under 3 years, but you're not small under 5 years, I strongly urge you to consider submitting comments and arguing for yourself a transition period. If you are a firm that is small under 3 years and not small under 5 years, unfortunately, it's going to happen. It's going to be a 5-year calculation at some point. Some would argue that that's what it is now under the federal law, but at some point in SBA's regulations, it's going to be a 5-year calculation. So if you want to shape that future for yourself and give yourself some time before you would be subject to a 5-year calculation, please consider submitting comments and also consider your option to do political outreach to your senators so that the Senate version of the NDAA will also include some type of transition period or transition option. Next, Peter's going to walk us through limitations on subcontracting and the changes that are coming along.
Thanks, Megan. So on December 4th, 2018, SBA issued a proposed rule to implement several provisions of the 2016 and 2017 NDAs and the RISE Act of 2015. The proposed rule addressed a number of small business issues. Most of them are listed here, but in the interest of time, we are not going to discuss all of them. Instead, we'll be focusing on, as Megan noted, proposed revisions impacting the limitations on subcontracting. However, if we have enough time, we will try to circle back to discuss some of the other issues, but as Megan indicated earlier, we do want to reserve a sufficient amount of time to address attendee questions. So if you have any questions on any of these issues, please don't hesitate to send them our way. As the slide indicates, the comment period has closed, so we're awaiting a final rule. We submitted our comments back in February, and so did about 35 others. So limitations on subcontracting is another hot button issue, and it has been a particularly hot one since SBA changed the self-performance calculation over 3 years ago. And seemingly in response to GAO reports noting that contracting officers have not been monitoring compliance with limitations on subcontracting, SBA has proposed a regulation to clarify that contracting officers may request information regarding limitations on subcontracting compliance. In the proposed rule, SBA sought comments on whether all small business prime contractors performing set-aside or sole source contracts should be required to demonstrate compliance, and if so, how often, meaning annually, quarterly, etc. They also sought comments on what type of data should contractors have to provide, and should compliance depend on the length or type of the contract or a contract with a certain dollar value threshold. Our position is that SBA should not require mandatory limitations on subcontracting compliance disclosures. We view it as yet another compliance burden for small businesses, and contracting officers already have the authority to request information from small businesses that's relevant to compliance with the limitations on subcontracting and routinely do so. However, if SBA does move forward and require mandatory compliance disclosures, we believe that the evidence provided to the contracting officer should take a similar form as the current certifications of compliance for joint ventures performing set-aside contracts. So for example, the contractor would make an annual certification that it has complied with the limitations on subcontracting at the end of the base year, and then again after each option year, as well as a project and compliance certification once the contract has been completed. SBA has also proposed revisions to its rules regarding when an independent contractor may be counted towards compliance with the limitations on subcontracting. In the proposed rule, SBA is proposing to distinguish between employee and revenue-based size standards for when an independent contractor counts towards limitations on subcontracting. For employee-based size standards, an independent contractor may be deemed an employee under the terms of SBA Size Policy Statement Number 1, which requires a totality of the circumstances analysis. But for revenue-based size standards, SBA is proposing that an independent contractor will never be considered an employee and instead will always be deemed a subcontractor. We believe the SBA's proposed rule on this issue provides more confusion than clarity regarding whether an independent contractor counts for purposes of compliance with limitations on subcontracting. And furthermore, if a totality of the circumstances analysis is the standard by which an independent contractor is determined to be an employee or a subcontractor, the test should be applied consistently across all small businesses, not just those that fall under employee-based size standards. SBA is also proposing to provide certain exclusions from the limitations on subcontracting calculation, and we believe this is and should be a welcome change. Under the proposed rule, it allows for the exclusion of other direct costs when they are not the principal purpose of the acquisition and small businesses do not provide the service, which means there are no subcontracting possibilities. The examples in the proposed rule are airline travel, work performed by a transportation or disposal entity under a contract with an environmental remediation code, cloud computing services, and mass media purchases. Our position or our thought is that these examples are good starts towards providing small business contractors, prime contractors, relief in being able to comply with the limitations on subcontracting, but we also believe there are additional industries beyond those listed in the proposed rule where there are no small business subcontracting possibilities, and the work being subcontractor is not the principal purpose of the acquisition. And for that reason, we think it makes sense for SBA to provide direction to small business prime contractors regarding the type of documentation or approval process they should undertake if they wish to exclude subcontracting costs that are not explicitly referenced in SBA's proposed rule. So the final FAR rule change that would implement the new limitations on subcontracting calculation, that was drafted earlier this month. And so now we are just waiting for it to be published and implemented. It's definitely been a long time coming, but hopefully this means that both the FAR and SBA regulations will soon provide for a limitations on subcontracting calculation based on total contract revenues. In the interim, however, civilian agencies will continue to follow the old calculation in the FAR, which is based on direct labor cost. DoD, though, issued a class deviation late last year that implements the new limitations on subcontracting calculation for all DoD contracts. And now Megan is going to discuss some of the proposed changes to the HUBZone program.
SBA issued a proposed rule back in October. Comments are closed. Again, we're still waiting for the final rule, but these are going to be some really big changes to the HUBZone program. The SBA's clear intent is to make the program as easy to participate, or I should say easier to participate in. As some of you might know now, it's a program where you might be eligible once you're awarded a contract, but as soon as you're awarded a contract and start staffing up that contract, your risk of losing your eligibility increases. So SBA is trying to address that and make it a program that more companies can participate in. The HUBZone spending goal is 3% of all federal procurement dollars, which is billions of dollars that is left on the table because the federal government has never met its 3% spending goal. So SBA is really trying to make the program accessible in order to help federal agencies to meet that 3% spending goal. So the HUBZone maps will be frozen until December 31st, 2021. There will be no more certifications required under the proposed rules of HUBZone status at bid and award. Instead, HUBZone firms will be certified annually. And then once you're certified, you can rely on that annual certification for a full year until your next annual certification. So it's eliminating the current 3-year intervals for recertification. Based on the rulemaking, it seems like SBA's intent is for the annual certification process not to be onerous for HUBZone firms, that it could be something, and this is what we suggested in our comments, that it could be just a representation to SBA that nothing has changed, you still are maintaining your percentage and your employees in your principal office, and therefore you're still an eligible HUBZone firm. This is a comprehensive overhaul of the HUBZone program. That's SBA's description of it. Again, SBA is really trying to make it as easy to comply as possible. And to that end, they've actually proposed changing the definition of employee. It's currently based on an individual who's working a minimum of 40 hours per month. But SBA has heard from industry that measuring the 40 hours per month can be tricky depending on how a company runs its payroll. So SBA has proposed changing that to an individual who works a minimum of 40 hours during the 4-week period immediately prior to the relevant date of review. And that relevant date of review would be that annual certification date or your recertification. This, I think, is the biggest change, is that how SBA is defining your residence and the impact that would have on the 35%. So SBA is proposing that reside for purposes of the 35% requirement, and again, that's that 35% of your employees must live in a HUBZone. That would mean that they must live at that location full-time for at least 180 days immediately prior to the date of application or recertification. But once your company is in the HUBZone program, once you're a certified HUBZone firm, if you're a HUBZone employee chooses to move out of a HUBZone, you are still able to count them as your HUBZone employee because they were a HUBZone employee at the time of your certification. SBA noted in its rulemaking that they did not want to punish these employees who are working for the company, and as a result of the company doing well and they personally doing well, that they somehow would feel like they could not move out of the HUBZone without risking losing their job. So SBA is saying firms would be allowed to continue counting these HUBZone employees after they move out of a HUBZone, so long as they resided in the HUBZone for at least 180 days immediately prior to the date of application or recertification. Peter's now going to take us through some upcoming changes to the WOSB and EDWOSB program.
Thanks, Megan. So the 2015 NDAA, it amended the Small Business Act to grant contracting officers the authority to award sole source contracts to women-owned small businesses and economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses. But in exchange for that sole sourcing, the 2015 NDA also created a requirement that a concern be formally certified to receive a woman-owned small business or economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business sole source or set-aside contract. So in other words, it eliminated self-certification. SBA was quick to act on the sole source piece. They issued a final rule in September 2015 that implemented the sole source authority, but they did not act so quickly with respect to the certification requirement. And keep in mind that the 2015 NDAA was published in December 2014. So that's a little over 4.5 years ago. And the proposed rule for certification procedures just came out in May of this year. With that said, I mean, to SBA's credit, the final rule implementing sole source authority, they didn't address the certification requirement because it is understandably more complicated. And SBA did not want to unnecessarily delay the implementation of sole sourcing for women-owned small businesses. So under the proposed rule, firms would be able to apply to SBA directly for certification as a woman-owned small business or an economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business. They would also be, or SBA would also accept certifications from SBA itself, such as an 8A certification, as well as certifications from third-party certifiers, the VA, assuming the concern is verified as a veteran-owned small business or a service-disabled veteran-owned small business, and certifications from state DBE programs. While we think this should help reduce application backlogs, we do have some concerns with the continued use of third-party certifiers, as it has been our experience that eligibility determinations performed by third-party certifiers, one, they can be fairly inconsistent, and that's in both substance of the eligibility criteria, as well as the timeframes for making determinations. If you do, when the certification procedures are in place and the final rule is issued, and you want to go to SBA directly to apply, you would do so online through certified.sba.gov, which is currently how you apply to the 8A program. It's also currently how you apply to the All Small MentorProtege program. Like the 8A program, there will be a 90-day determination timeframe, which begins once SBA deems the application complete. And if you get denied by SBA, you could address deficiencies to come into compliance and then submit what's called a request for reconsideration. So for example, you could revise your operating agreement to address a finding that the woman owner does not control all of the LLC decision making, and then submit that as part of your request for reconsideration. So a request for reconsideration truly is your second bite at the apple. However, SBA's decision on reconsideration would be the final decision of SBA, meaning there would be no right to appeal to SBA's Office of Hearings and Appeals, and the applicant would have to wait 1 year to reapply. We don't believe this is a fair approach. Other set-aside programs hinging on ownership and control requirements, such as the 8A program, allow for appeals of application denials to OHA, and we see no reason why women-owned small business program applicants should not be allowed a proper review as well. SBA also requested comments on whether they should permit a concern to submit an offer on a set-aside contract for woman-owned small businesses if they have submitted an application but have not received a negative determinant from SBA. And if the firm becomes the apparent successful offeror, the contracting officer would notify SBA, and SBA would expedite the application, making a determination within 15 days. We agree with this approach for two reasons. One, it'll prioritize concerns that are currently submitting bids, and it also recognizes that there will undoubtedly be some delay in processing certification applications once the rule is finalized. An alternative solution that we believe SBA should consider is to establish a one-year grace period for firms to submit applications and for SBA to complete the certification process. And then during this time period, all previously self-certified firms could submit offers on woman-owned small business procurements, even if they have not submitted applications to SBA. Our thought is that this approach would give concerns time to submit applications, and at the same time, not put undue pressure on SBA to review applications at a breakneck speed. The May 29, 2019 proposed rule relating to the woman-owned small business certification, it also proposed to increase the economic disadvantage thresholds for initial 8A program eligibility. The current thresholds are $250,000 for personal net worth, $250,000 for personal income, and $4 million for total assets. But under the economically disadvantaged women-owned small business regs, the thresholds are higher, and they mirror those for continued 8A program eligibility. SBA doesn't think it makes sense, however, that a woman could be deemed economically disadvantaged for women-owned small business program purposes, but then be denied 8A certification for not being economically disadvantaged, and we agree. And furthermore, the $250,000 threshold for personal net worth, that's existed for decades. And for the 8A program requirements to keep pace with the changing realities of participating in the federal procurement marketplace, we think an increase is definitely necessary. So the proposed rule, it would eliminate this distinction in the 8A program for initial entry into and continued eligibility for the program. So what that means is the thresholds for both would be $350,000 personal income, $750,000 net worth, and $6 million for total assets. SBA also requested comments on whether a $375,000 net worth threshold should apply to both the 8A and the economically disadvantaged women-owned small business program. We don't think it should. I mean, particularly for economically disadvantaged women-owned small business program participants, as this could potentially disqualify an astronomical number of previously qualified economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses who were able to demonstrate economic disadvantage under a $750,000 threshold. SBA is also proposing some significant changes to the 8A and MentorProtege programs. First, they're proposing to consolidate the 8A MentorProtege program with the all-small MentorProtege program and effectively do away with the 8A MentorProtege program. And frankly, we see no reason not to. Both programs offer the same benefits, namely the ability of a protege to joint venture with its mentor as a small business for any federal procurement, provided the protege is small and carries the applicable socioeconomic designation. In addition, we think that the all-small MentorProtege program has been a huge success. Applications are still being processed relatively quickly, and it is our experience that 8A firms are applying, a lot of 8A firms are applying to the all-small program as opposed to the 8A MentorProtege program just for that reason. In addition, applying to the all-small MentorProtege program, there's a lot less paperwork involved, and so it's less of a burdensome process. Also, there haven't been any open and closed periods, which really was SBA's rationale behind keeping the 8A MentorProtege program intact when it rolled out the all-small program. SBA is also considering whether to eliminate the requirement for SBA approval of 8A joint ventures for competitive procurements. So SBA would only approve 8A joint ventures for sole source contracts. This is yet another welcome change. It has been our experience that the approval process for 8A joint ventures, it varies from district office to district office. It's often delayed until the awardee has been identified, and it's really just an unnecessary burden on small businesses. SBA may require 8A applicants to complete a tutorial to help them determine if they are ready to be in the 8A program. And while I appreciate SBA's concern with admitting firms to the program that never receive any 8A contracts, if the tutorial is anything like the one for the all small MentorProtege program, I just don't see it deterring potential 8A program applicants just based on the benefits that are available to program participants. Lastly, SBA is considering whether to relax the requirement that a protege be limited to 2 mentor firms in its lifetime. What they're considering is if a protege firm does not receive the assistance contemplated under the MPA and decides to terminate the relationship within the first 18 months, SBA would not count that relationship towards the 2 in lifetime requirement. And relaxing this requirement would be yet another welcome change, as we have seen a number of protege firms get into these relationships, and 6 months down the road, or even sooner, they start to go south. And the relationship has to be terminated, and there goes one of the 2 chances to participate in the 8A program. So we do believe this requirement has to be relaxed, and I think what SBA is considering is a step in the right direction. So that concludes our presentation. If you have any questions, go ahead and send them now if you haven't done so already. Megan and I will try to answer as many we can in the next 20 minutes or so. If we don't get to your question before the webinar is over, don't worry. We will follow up with you via email.
And Peter, I wanted to also mention that a lot of this information has been covered in our weekly update newsletter. If you do not already receive our newsletter, please go to our website, PilieroMazza.com, and sign up. You can select what type of information you're interested in, but that weekly update newsletter, it's free and it's chock full of information for government contractors. So starting at the top, will copies of the slides be available? Yes, copies of the slides will be available. If you registered for the webinar, you will receive them via email. This recording will also be available on YouTube. Substantive question, new dollar size in effect yesterday, does it apply to previously awarded contracts where there were ramp offs due to size? So a new size standard would apply to a current contract in the event that you are required to recertify your size on that contract. So if you're at, for instance, at the end of a long-term contract and you need to recertify before the next option is exercised, then the new size standard would apply. If you have a task order based contract and the contracting officer expressly requires recertification for that task order, the new size standard would apply. So anytime that you need to certify to the government what your size is as of August 19th, 2019 going forward, it's going to be the new size standard. Next question, if the 5-year calculation becomes retroactive, how are agencies going to implement? What can we as industry expect from government contracting agencies? If the 5-year calculation becomes retroactive, it would not affect your current contracts. The intent there is just to cover for the firms that have been pursuing small business opportunities under the 5-year calculation, to give them coverage so that they could keep those contracts and not be subject to any kind of misrepresentation of size. It's meant to show that the firms that have been following the law have been doing so in good faith. Sorry again. Next question. What do you mean by a retroactive transition of the SBA Runway Extension Act? I think I referred to a retroactive application, and again, that's Congress's intent is to try to provide coverage to the firms that have wanted to take advantage of the 5-year calculation now, or frankly, since December of 2018. notwithstanding that SBA's regulations still require a 3-year calculation. The transition period that we are advocating for, and that's currently in the House version of the NDAA and the Senate Small Business Committee's version of the SBA Reauthorization Act, that transition period is meant to allow firms that are small under a 3-year calculation, but not small under a 5-year calculation, adjust going forward. So that is a prospective transition period. Next question, how do you see this impacting state law? For an example, in Maryland, they currently rely on a 3-year period for size standards. Have state legislators started to act on this to your knowledge? Do we need to start reaching out to state delegates and senators as well? To my knowledge, I'm not aware of any state making any movement on this. I know that in Maryland, since you referenced Maryland, the Montgomery County Chamber is very much on top of this as far as the federal procurement size standard. But at a state level, I suspect that many states would just follow, once this is in SBA's regulations, they would just refer to SBA's regulations.
Yeah, and most DVE programs, obviously they do vary from state to state, but most are consistent in that when they get to size, they point to the SBA and says we will determine size in accordance with how SBA does it. So once the rule is finalized and the 5-year calculation is in the SBA's regulations, I think they're going to defer to the SBA and they'll use a 5-year calculation as well.
Next, I heard that SBA at one point was entertaining allowing firms to elect 3 consecutive years under a 5-year surveillance period for the area office to use in resolving a protest, etc. Did SBA make reference to that idea under the proposed rule, especially why it rejected that approach? So I think this is referring to an idea that had been floating around for a couple of years of the 3 out of 5. So prior to the Small Business Runway Extension Act, the Small Business Act said that agencies shall calculate a firm size based on at least 3 years of revenues, that at least 3 years is important. So there was a movement to try to get SBA by regulation only without getting Congress involved. Under the fact that the Act says at least 3 years, SBA could conceivably say, okay, we'll do a 5-year calculation, but we'll pick your 3 lowest years to determine your size. SBA rejected that effort. Congress also rejected that effort based in part on SBA's resistance to implementing it. So that's how we got to a 5-year calculation, just a straight up 5-year calculation instead. Peter, a question for you. Does the DoD deviation on limitation on subcontracting include the dollar penalty for failure to comply?
Are you talking about the presumed loss rate rule, or is this?
I'm not sure. To my knowledge, it does not. The DoD deviation, the class deviation, addresses the calculation for limitations on subcontracting, which Peter spoke to, which is the overall dollar amount versus cost of personnel. And it also implements the similarly situated rule. I'm not aware of it including any kind of dollar penalty. Next, how does the 180-day rule apply to college students? I believe this is a reference to the proposed HUBZone rule and how reside is defined for purposes of a HUBZone employee. So a college student would have to live full-time in that area, the HUBZone, for 180 days continuously prior to the certification date. So for a college student, it would seem then that the certification of the firm needs to come at the end of the school year, or else the college student might not meet that full-time 180-day requirement. This is, again, not final. SBA in the final rulemaking may take a turn on this based on comments from industry, but this is just what SBA proposed. A number of the proposed HUBZone program changes seem like SBA asking for industry comments on ideas. Has SBA issued clarification regarding which concepts are seriously being considered as rule changes? No, SBA has not issued any such clarification. It might be that we won't hear from SBA on these issues until SBA issues the final rule. It would be unusual for SBA to issue something in between a proposed rule and a final rule.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add to that is at the 8A conference in Alaska earlier this summer, John Klein did point out a couple of things that they are seriously considering, one of which is whether to have the annual certification requirement be 2 years instead of 1 or 3 years instead of 1. And then he also made it very clear, or pretty clear at least, that the definition of an employee is not going to change. And again, that's based on the feedback that, the negative feedback that they got from industry.
Peter, another question for you. I think some folks got confused on the WOSB slide with regard to Solesource, since the Solesource authority was you give some, you take some. So we got the Solesource authority, and we also got this requirement for certification. So there have been a couple questions about WOSB Solesource. The question specifically is, can WOSB receive Solesource awards? If yes, what's the contract ceiling? 4 million, question mark. If not, why not?
Yeah, they, you can receive sole source contracts. Women-owned small businesses can receive sole source contracts, but there's an analysis, meaning unlike the 8A regulations, where they don't have to do an analysis to determine whether there are, two entities that could submit a competitive bid. They have to do that in the woman-owned small business regulations, and in fact, all of the current regulations that pertain to sole sourcing for the other set-aside programs. So yes, you can, but it's just not as simple as it is under the 8A program. And frankly, that's one thing that we believe SBA should change, meaning what's in the 8A program, meaning the ability to get a sole source contract when you are just, when there may be potential other companies out there that can perform the work. We believe that that is an analysis, a simpler analysis that should apply across the board. In terms of the limits, I believe it's $4 million and then $7 million for manufacturing.
Next question. My understanding is that if I'm certified by the VA as an SDVOSB or by a state certified program as a WOSB, I do not have to be certified by any other third party. Is this correct?
That is what SBA is proposing, meaning SBA would accept applications, meaning you could apply to SBA itself. And again, that's all good. The reason they're doing this, and meaning they're accepting these other certifications, is they understand that they have limited resources and there's going to be a bottleneck. I mean, there's going to be a backlog of applications. A lot of the regulations, for example, that pertain to VOSBs and SDVOSBs as they relate to ownership and control, and the 8A program ownership and control requirements, they're very similar. Many of them are identical to the woman-owned small business program. So under the proposed rule, if you have a verified status as a VOSB or SDVOSB, or you're certified by the state of Maryland as a DBE, you could use that certification to essentially waive in to the SBA's program.
And just, there are a couple of follow-on questions that we can hit now too, that currently, under current regulations, WOSBs do not have to be third-party certified. WOSBs currently are allowed to self-certify, but they have to upload certain documents to certify.sba.gov. So what Peter spoke to is a proposed rule that will be implemented because it's driven by an act of Congress, that at some point in the future, a WOSB will have to go through a certification process. Peter, would the term for the 8A MentorProtege program change from 9 years to align with the all small MentorProtege program?
We haven't seen anything from SBA, meaning having a 9-year term in the MentorProtege program. Is that the question?
Correct.
That'd be great. Frankly, I think they could even go a step further and say that you can be a protege. There's no limit. I mean, there's no 2 in lifetime limit. And you could have, so long as you could be in the program as a protege, so long as you don't have 2 mentors concurrently, meaning a mentor could drop off and you could pick up another mentor. I mean, this of course assumes that you still need business development assistance. But right now, I mean, that's what the regulations allow a mentor to do, meaning a mentor can have up to 3 proteges. And then the moment one drops off, they can pick up another. So they don't have any sort of cap or limit in their ability to participate in the all small program. And I just don't see any reason why proteges shouldn't have that benefit as well. My understanding is that that's not something that SBA is really giving a ton of thought to. I think they're going to kind of meet us in the middle, but if I had to guess, I don't think they're going to make the term, because currently it's a 3-year term. So, and you can have a max of 2 relationships. So you add it together, it's a 6-year term combined. I don't think it's going to change to a 9-year term.
And this question could be driven by, prior to implementation of the All Small Mentor Protege program, the 8A Mentor Protege agreement was allowed to be in place for the duration of the 8A firm's participation in the 8A program, which conceivably could be 9 years. However, once the All Small Mentor Protege program was rolled out, the 8A Mentor Protege program was also revised. And so currently the 8A Mentor Protege program, the max term is 6 years to align with the All Small Mentor Protege program. Peter, there's some confusion on the limits on mentors for proteges that SBA is proposing. The slide seemed to address limits on proteges for mentors, that a mentor couldn't have more than 3 proteges at a time. Could you just clear that up?
Right. So there's the general rule is that a mentor can have 1 protege, but a mentor can have up to 3 proteges concurrently, meaning 3 proteges at the same time, if the parties can demonstrate that mentor-protege relationship 1 isn't going to compete with mentor-protege relationship 2 or mentor-protege relationship 3. So what that means, if the one relationship is under a construction code, and let's say they want to have another relationship, a good way to demonstrate that they're not going to compete would not be to have that relationship be under a construction code. I mean, you could probably do it under your specialty trade construction code and be able to demonstrate that there's no competition there. With respect to proteges, you can have 2 mentors in your lifetime. If you wanted to, you could have 2 mentors at the same time. Again, the general rule is that you can have 1 mentor, but you can have 2 mentors at the same time. But to do so, you need to demonstrate to the SBA that you have a mentor, or let's just say the second mentor has a certain expertise that your first mentor doesn't possess. And I've talked to this about clients because it is a question that comes up. Again, with the understanding that you're limited to 2 relationships, you may want to consider whether you really want to have 2 mentor-protege relationships as a protege going at the same time, because you really, given that you're capped to 2-3-year terms, you want to make the most out of both mentor-protege relationships. And as a small business, you just may not be able to do that if you have 2 mentor-protege relationships going on at the same time. But like I said, you can do it.
Next question, any news when the final HUBZone regulations will be released? I have not heard anything. Peter, have you heard anything from SBA on that?
I heard that SBA is aiming to have the final rule issued as of December 1st, 2020.
Oh, December 1st, 2020. Okay, that's good to know. Given the lag in deciding WOSB certification protocols, do you recommend self-certifying in SBA and being ready for the SBA formal certification, or hedging by getting the state DBE? Or follow another there were a couple questions along this point, or going to a third-party certifier. In my opinion, it would be prudent for any WOSB or EDWOSB that's currently self-certifying to go ahead and look into and start the third party or DBE certification process. Because once this WOSB certification rule is implemented, which again is going to take some time, but once it's in place, there could be a potential bottleneck. SBA is going to try to address that bottleneck, but if you would rather be a firm that stays ahead rather than behind, that is something to consider. SBA, in addressing the bottleneck, is going to give some type of, to use my catchphrase, transition period, where firms would be allowed to go through the certification. But if you just want to avoid that altogether, you could look into doing that now. Peter, a large prime has multiple sectors. Would each sector have the 3 protege limits under the SBA MentorProtege program? And could a protege have multiple mentors from the limited 2?
On the first question, the answer is no. It was actually something that I think we suggested to SBA that it shouldn't be an issue. For example, if your mentor or the would-be mentor is General Dynamics, what's to say that they and let's just assume they have multiple divisions, multiple subsidiaries. What's to say that they shouldn't, each division, each subsidiary should be allowed to have 3 proteges concurrently? But SBA rejected that, and so even if it's a huge company and has multiple divisions, multiple subsidiaries, the company itself as a whole is capped at 3 concurrent. And what was the second question?
And the protege, I think you've touched on this, but the idea that a protege could have more than 2 mentors.
Right. Yes, a protege can have. Well, no. I mean, you're capped right now at 2 mentors in a lifetime, but you can have more than one more than one mentor concurrently. But again, the general rule is you can only have 1. But once you've maxed out, meaning you've had 2 mentors under the current regulations, you're done in terms of being able to participate in the program.
Next question, how often are size limits adjusted? They are supposed to, by law, to be adjusted every 5 years. So a substantive adjustment every 5 years, and then they can do inflation adjustments in between that period of time. The last substantive adjustment was in 2012. So doing some simple math, SBA was supposed to issue adjustments in 2017. SBA did not do so for a variety of factors, including that it was working on the revised size standard methodology. So we are still waiting for the substantive size standard adjustments that should have come in 2017, and those are the ones that SBA said would come in the near future. So near future is my best estimate. Peter, this is an 8A program question. For the 8A program, is there any proposal to begin counting the maximum of 8 years, which I think is actually supposed to be a reference to 9 years in the program, for a firm when the firm first receives an 8A award, rather than beginning immediately?
Not that I've heard, and I don't see SBA doing that. And again, it goes back to this whole notion that SBA isn't going to let you into the program unless they think you have these potential to succeed. And they're very adamant in terms of saying this is not a program that's designed for startup firms. So when you apply to the program and they admit you to the program, they're doing so under the assumption that you're going to market yourself and you're going to go after and be very proactive in getting 8A contracts. And a lot of firms, what they do, it's unfortunate, they get into the 8A program and they get nothing out of it. But what I tell clients is that once you get in, don't rely on SBA to start handing you work. It doesn't work like that anymore. You really do need to market yourself and leverage your status. I mean, once you have that 8A status, you're a very valuable asset to a large business mentor who can leverage your status and now go after 8A contracts as a joint venture with you. But to answer the question, I don't see that happening.
Peter, do primes need to get new reps and certs from their existing WOSB vendors in their approved suppliers list for federal jobs? Or do the new certification requirements on WOSB, EDWOSB only apply to women-owned small business competing for work going forward?
My understanding is it's the latter.
And they're not, the certification requirements are not in place yet. So it's not a final rule yet. No need to get new reps and certs from your current WOSB, EDWOSB vendors. In the future, once the certification requirement is in place through a final rulemaking by SBA, depending on the transition period that SBA adopts for those WOSB firms, a prime may want to do something similar of requiring proof of certification at that point in time, but that's in the future, not currently. To compete for a contract for a certified disabled veteran-owned business. Oh, sorry, that person has left. Okay. Can you advise on the status on FAR case 2018-003 on credit for lower tier small business subcontracting? How does the government plan to have prime contractors select goals for other than small business first tier contractors as part of the proposal process? Will this be a hard goal? On MATOC contracts, it will be difficult to predict since awards under a MATOC are competitive and not predetermined. So I think there was a rulemaking that was published just a couple weeks ago that addresses this. It does implement this. The wrinkle in all of this is that the reporting system, the ESRS, to my knowledge, has not yet been updated. So while primes are allowed to track this data, they don't have a way of reporting it yet. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to see what other questions we haven't answered yet. So Peter, there's a couple follow-on questions. Just clarifying one more time. How many mentors can a protege have? How many proteges can a mentor have? And what is SBA proposing with regard to either or both of those things?
So a mentor can have up to 3 proteges concurrently. And again, that means 3 proteges at the same time, so long as they can demonstrate that the relationships are not going to compete with each other. For a protege, you're capped at 2. And what that means is, well, again, the general rule is you can have 1 mentor, but you can also make a case that you need a second mentor-protege relationship if you can demonstrate that the second mentor or second proposed mentor doesn't possess a certain expertise that the first mentor or possesses a certain expertise that the first mentor lacks. But and I think this is part of the question. Once you have your 2 mentors, you're done in terms of being able to participate in the program. So if you have, and it could be you could have 1 mentor, and you just happen to do that relationship twice, meaning you do it for the initial 3-year term, and then you renew it for another 3-year term, but it's with the same mentor. Once you've maxed out at 6 years, even though it's with the same mentor, you're no longer eligible to participate.
HUBZone question. If a HUBZone employee does not meet the 180-day measure, i.e. employed for less than 180 days, are they counted as non-HUBZone or are they not counted as at all? Under SBA's proposed rule, an employee who did not reside in a HUBZone for the full 180 days prior to the certification date would count as an employee, but would not count as a HUBZone employee. So they would not count in the 35% requirement. But just to reiterate, this is a proposed rule. It is totally conceivable that when SBA issues the final rule, which Peter gave us all insight that the SBA is aiming to do so by December 1st, 2020, that SBA could change this 180 days to, let's say, 60 days. So, or they could increase it to 300 days. So we still have to wait to see what's in the final rule, but as participants or future participants in the HUBZone program, it's good to kind of keep this on your radar. And I think that is all of our questions for today. We went a little bit over, but we were able to address many of your questions. If we did not, then we will reach out to you separately. Thank you all for attending. Please feel free to email either of us. Our email addresses are on the screen. Peter, any closing words for the audience?
No, I just want to thank everyone for joining today. And like Megan said, if you have any follow-up questions, our contact information is right there. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us via email, because a lot of what we discussed this afternoon, I mean, it's not black and white. So if you have questions, again, please don't hesitate to shoot us an email.
Thank you all very much.